Well, hello to you both, and welcome back to New Musical Chairs, a post-punk podcast. I am Jay, and we are back with part 2 of the Cathi Unsworth interview. This is where we pick 10 great goth records that we want to shout about and shout to you about. Perhaps if you're starting to get into this stuff, looking for a bit of a primer, we're going to be putting together a Spotify playlist as well, which will be in the description below. We're not saying these are the best, so before both of you jump into the comments and decry that we haven't included this record or that, we're just saying these are ones that we like. Don't forget to like, subscribe, share this around, pin the tail on the donkey, all that stuff. Let me know what you think and comment on your favourite part of the episode as well. This will be up on SoundCloud, Spotify, here on YouTube in video form. There'll be a link somewhere around here in this area if you're watching on YouTube. If you haven't checked out part 1 yet, go and do so now. Next interview is going to be Deborah Ayal from Romeo Void. Very, very excited about that. In the meantime, let's get back to it with Cathi. And speaking of spreading the love, Cathi and I have picked 10 tracks from 10 goth artists we love. These are not by any means like the top 10 of everything or the top 20 of everything. It's just 10 great goth picks that we've kind of spent weeks labouring over. I think we've both changed our picks several times. I've really tried not to change mine again since yesterday, so we might throw some honourable mentions in there, but this is kind of a little primer, I guess, for if anybody wants to explore this stuff further, check these songs out. So I think probably a fun way to do it is maybe, Cathi, if you do your first one and then I'll do my first one. We'll talk a little bit about each one and just work our way through.
Yeah, sure. Well, my first one, we've just been talking about them, is Joy Division, because my book starts with Joy Division, and even if you don't think they're goths, at the centre of the city where all roads meet is Ian Curtis on that amazing World in Action footage that they cut for the first time he appeared on TV on that underlaying strange black and white footage of him doing his. We've just said how Joy Division encapsulated that whole world, and everyone does know how tragic the story of Ian Curtis and everyone who loved him around actually was. The fact that he was given a job, social services, trying to help people who have epilepsy, and within 6 months of that, he's got it himself. And as his wife seems to suggest in her memoir, was he so empathetic that who knows, whatever. Anyway, for me, my goth journey starts with them, and they also bring back what that time was like in 1979 when Margaret Thatcher was first elected. That whole winter of discontent, that whole nationwide, I can see the nationwide, like if you've never saw it anyway. But, that whole rubbish piling up in the streets, grave diggers out on strike, that whole atmosphere of magic murder and the vile psychic weather, that's what was in that record.
It's interesting. So firstly, I didn't plan this and I didn't notice it until just now. The coaster I've been standing my glass of water on is Unknown Pleasures. I think those records have never really dated. They just sound out of time, ahead of time, behind time. My partner Fran is Joy Division and the Bunnymen are her two favourite bands. So we had the pleasure of going to see Peter Hook and the Light last 2 years ago when he did his Unknown Pleasures and Closer tour. And to see that stuff live, because you forget actually when you listen to Joy Division bootlegs, they were they were a tough band. They weren't this they weren't these waif-like guys. They were a tough live band that Martin Hannett saw something in to,
They didn't like what he was doing at first.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it, that Hooky now, and well, all of them, but Hooky, I guess I've kind of kept the tabs on the most because he just seems like a cool guy, I suppose. But, they all kind of see the brilliance of it now. And I think it's exactly like you said, Cathi, that they see the brilliance of it because it immediately transports them back to all of that.
For sure.
And it's interesting that you go with Joy Division as your first pick, because my first pick is a band that they did play with, but at the opposite end of the country and with a completely different style and approach is Bauhaus. And the song I picked was Hollow Hills, from 1981, second album, Mask, fittingly close to Halloween. I think it came out in October 1981. But Peter Murphy's not a goth, everybody remember.
Never looked anything like one, did he?
Never. This album's an interesting one because it gets held up critically, certainly latterly, as their finest moment. And I think it's interesting. It definitely establishes their sort of mishmash of genres, perhaps more than the first album did. Burning from the Inside gets looked at as the outlier because Peter wasn't very well and wasn't involved in it a lot. But to me, when I listen to the early records, excluding Go Away White here, the reunion album, the first album, In the Flat Field, feels like the outlier because there's the tendrils of the punk influence in there, whereas Mask and everything after that, it feels like that kind of post-punk truism of four people playing a different song at the same time.
Yeah.
And, you know, it's almost like collage. And I think Hollow Hills is a fantastic centerpiece, but it could have been easy to pick Kick in the Eye or Passion of Lovers. The latter's a big favourite for me because it's got Daniel Ash playing 12-string on it, and I think he's a really underrated rhythm player. But it had to be Hollow Hills. I think it's maybe the Bauhaus song. It's so desolate. You've got Daniel Ash's sort of whistling e-bowed guitar really far back in the mix. It kind of sounds like wind beating on a farmhouse door.
Like Joy Division, sound like the city. That's an interesting thing about Bauhaus, I think, how they do sound like the wild countryside.
When I think Bauhaus, I just think of like, it feels like it's coming at you through a transistor radio. Like there's all this static in there, you know. Peter's vocal on that track on Hollow Hills, it's so desolate and yet it's right between your eyes because of the way it's mixed, and it almost feels like he's speaking for you, not to you. It's like he's kind of in your head. And I love that about it. And I love that little arpeggiated guitar that comes in right at the end and then bang, it's over. Really cool. And I think Bauhaus were great at that, you know, these idea songs where they'd take all these strange composite parts that really shouldn't work. They'd give you a little snippet of something and then that would be it, it's over.
Yeah. Like you'd wandered into a long barrow and had a strange experience and you woke up in the morning and did that really ever happen?
It was all a dream. Cool. So number 2 for you, Cathi.
We've already talked about the Cramps and their glory, and I picked Garbage Man because I think it's the coolest song that probably anyone ever wrote, actually. And when Luck says, if you can't dig me, you can't dig nothing, there's really no arguing with that. You know, I picked it out because they wrote this one, and even though, you know, you can't, on any Cramps album, you can't tell which ones are cover versions and which ones they wrote, but this is like they wrote this and it's better than any of their cover versions as well. And, you know, there was a hilarious quote that Luck said about when they did Surfing Bird, that because the word bird is the word is the word, blah, 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 says more about rock and roll than Patti Smith will do in a whole album. But I think that he says he calls the core essence of rock and roll is contained within the lyrics he wrote for this song, which are really brilliant. It's one half hillbilly, one half punk. It's got 8 long legs and a great big mouth, the coolest thing from the north to come out of the south. Do you understand?
Yeah. I mean, if anybody hasn't heard or seen the Cramps before, first of all, look at a picture of them because they're one of the coolest looking bands of all time. Scary, as you said earlier, Cathi. Like, they'll do a number on you, but they'll look damn fine while they're doing it. That tune is just, like you said, it's the perfect sort of combination of glam and sleaze, and, you know, there's this seedy underbelly kind of dripping from it. Oh, Oh, yeah, it's great.
Mm.
And that is goth, right?
Yeah, that is.
So,
Cooler than Lux, name one.
no one. And what could be more different than that than my number 2 pick, which is Phoenix by The Cult from 1985. So, worth saying at this point, we've tried to stick to the late 70s up to the early sort of mid 80s, basically before everything went completely mainstream. And I think The Cult and Love, that's probably why I've included this. This was also my gateway band and my gateway album. Fun story, She Sells Sanctuary was on a video game soundtrack, Grand Theft Auto Vice City, which was set in Miami. It's basically meant to be like Miami Vice. Cracking soundtrack on there. I heard She Sells Sanctuary on that. Bought the album later. But this record is the apex of, for me at least, it's the apex of gothic rock, as in gothic. It's because it's the most overt display of Zeppelin worship without being quite so literal about it. It's so psychedelic, this one. I could have picked a few tunes off of Love, to be honest. But
what we called light bulb changing dancing tune.
Absolutely. And I'll die on the hill of saying that this is probably the best gothic rock album that's probably ever been made. I think I use that phrase advisedly because it is a gothic rock record.
Yeah.
Steve Brown produced it. He'd worked with Wham previously. And it's so well put together. The layers of Billy Duffy's guitar, the way he was able to kind of distill all of these different competing guitar parts into a singular idea, I just thought it's so well put together, that record. But Phoenix is an interesting one because Cult fans will know this. I think it was the last track, along with the title track, the 2 last tracks they recorded for it, that were a lot kind of heavier. Steve Brown didn't know how to mix it because there's so much wah-wah and different layers on it. So he just started pushing all the faders up. Ian loved that and started riffing on the lyric in the studio. And I just think it's goth at its most bombastic right before it kind of went over into the mainstream. You've got this band with an identifiable style starting to shed their skin for something new. And a lot of bands started to try that around the mid-80s, and some were more successful than others. But I think it showed the songwriting and the star power that Billy and Ian had. And it's a great, fun, overblown, glorious track. And yeah, I think that nowadays the Cult get taken a little bit more seriously again, and the American thing that they went and did later on, I do understand why people have a problem with that. But yeah, Phoenix.
Exactly. Don't apologise, don't explain.
Number 3 for you, Cathi.
So number 3 for me is Lydia Lunch, Knives in My Drain, which is a total work of masterpiece art. And
yes, it is.
And it's from the Queen of Siam album, which was very influential on people like Mark Almond and people who heard it over here. And Lydia came to live here shortly after she made this album. But what's so amazing about it, this is what's so amazing about Lydia, is she never really repeats herself. She just moves on to new stuff. But she also there's another thing I think is quite central to goth. She looks for forgotten things, like we've just seen the Cramps finding rockabilly and going, whoa, we'll have a bit of that. She got this guy, Willy Verplank, who had worked with Tommy Dorsey, one of the greatest swing bands of that whole era, which is another music that I find have been increasingly obsessed with since writing about stories set in World War II swing jazz and how subversive that is. And she started out with Teenage Jesus the Jerks, full on Sonic Attack, and it's an exorcism really of the terrible things that happened to Lydia in her very young life. And it's still shocking to me, even when I listen to these records now, how young her voice sounds, how young she actually is. And in this she plays the character in this song Knives in My Drain is a bit like Tra-la-la, the character in Hewitt's LBG Last Exit to Brooklyn, who's this teenage girl who gets multiply raped. She's seen everything. She's seen all the stuff you shouldn't have seen when you're that old. And she sings it with that world where it's got this fantastic noir jazz. It really sounds like you imagine the Manhattan of Ouija rather than Son of Sam, which I think her previous record sounded like the Manhattan of Son and Sam. This sounds like Ouija's Manhattan, the mobsters and the 40s. And she just sings this little girl's voice, the most like a sort of Billie Holiday song would do. And that metaphor of knives in my drain, yeah. And she sings, I've got the cancer of youth. And I say, what's the use? In that little girl's voice, it's amazing. She's amazing.
It's interesting. I'm really pleased you mentioned Billie Holiday because I was meant to bring this up earlier on. One of your Goth Mother sections covers Billie, and I think we mentioned the quote about Ian Curtis and the tragedy of Ian Curtis, and yeah, you can't really mention Billie Holiday and not think of tragedy, and this just incredible figure, kind of music just kind of pouring out of her. With this, again, extraordinary voice when you think about how young she was.
Yeah. She worked with Tommy Dorsey. And yeah, he said it was like seeing how Louis Armstrong could improvise. She could do that. She was a genius. But she never had, no one ever looked after Billie properly. No one ever cared for her. Everyone just leeched off her. It's such a tragic story. I think that Lydia early on really recognised that quality in Billie and kind of channels her in this song. Really.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
So my number 3, I swapped around this morning. So I'm going to mention I'll give an honourable mention to my original number 3 at the end of this, but I've made my number 3 Daniel Dax. And the song I've picked is Hammerheads from Jesus Egg That Wept, 1984. My favourite album of hers is Inky Bloaters, which came out in 87, but I thought it was a little bit late for this, so I picked Hammerheads. I just think that it, like you said earlier on, part of what you wanted to get out of your book, or get into your book, sorry, was the role of women in goth, and I think Danielle is perfect for that and she's perfect for this idea of, like you've just said with Lydia, taking things that people have maybe forgotten about, or taking elements from, I'll have a bit of that, I'll have a bit of that, I'll have a bit of that, and putting them into this collage of stuff, and yet somehow being able to make sense of it. And I think Danielle's a perfect figure for that. She looked great. She found a way of, because there's there are stories within the book and elsewhere where she sort of talks about just sort of learning to play all these strange instruments, and there's such experimentation in all of her work, including the stuff on Dark Adapted Eye, which was all the sort of pop-centric stuff she did. But even then, she manages to find a way of making it interesting and taking, why can't I take this doo-wop idea and take a Turkish saz and put that on top of it. So I wanted to put Danielle in here because I really think that she's an artist who should have been a lot more successful than she was. And I think she does get forgotten about a little bit to people who may be quite as entrenched in this culture as others. And I think we can talk about Susie and people of her ilk, but I think Danielle deserves to be in there as well.
She does, and it's good that you've said Inky Bloaters as well, because that's the one where she did absolutely everything herself on it. So that was.
So that's a bit of a cheat. So Hammerheads is my pick as a track, but if you're going to listen to an album of hers, go and listen to Inky Bloaters because it's amazing. My number 3, Danielle Dax.
Brilliant.
Number 4.
I've taken Susie and the Banshees Night Shift because I think that is probably the scariest record of that 80s, especially of that 1981. And especially the fact that she wrote that before they caught Peter Sutcliffe. He was the bogeyman haunting the first half of my book, who's running amok, and seemingly the West Yorkshire police can't catch him no matter what they do. And he didn't get caught until victim number 13, and he got picked up by two coppers that were just beat coppers doing their job properly, where all the detectives had failed. But somehow Susie had managed to intuit certain things about this character, which she seems to suggest in her lyrics anyway. I mean, I've never talked to her about it, I don't know. But when she writes things that like, is always silent and kind, unlike the others, it's really spooky because the victims of who survived at Peter Sutcliffe's attack said things like, he just came up to me and said, weather's letting us down a bit today, isn't it, love? You know, sounding all nice and friendly before smashing them over the head with a ball peen hammer. So I don't know. And that now she's got, you know, the Banshees, I agree with you that this is my favourite incarnation of them, with John McGeoch on guitar and Budgie. So Budgie and John McKeown from the left-hand side of the Pennines are bringing that Pennines weather into the Banshees, and the whole sound of this record is so scary and so evocative of what it felt like, you know, when he was loose, when nobody knew who he was, when he was still walking the streets. It's a brilliant channeling of that really scary period, I think.
There's a great book by Rory Sullivan Burke, a biography of John McGeoch called The Light Pours Out of Me. I'd like to get Rory on here at some point, but I just want to do a hat tip to that because that's a really worthwhile read. And everybody who knew John is in there. And I think, like you said, John and Budgie brought something. Every lineup of the Banshees brings something new to the table, which I get the feeling that's what Susie and Stephen really wanted. That they didn't want whoever came into the band must be different to whoever's just left. Every lineup is great and they produce some great records, but there is just something about that McGeoch lineup that stands above the others. And I think Juju in particular, Nigel Gray producing that, and it again, a bit like I mentioned with Danielle Datz, they're able to take these really quite subversive ideas, complex arrangements as well, and distill them into these really compact tracks, lots of bits in it. But, you know, and Night Shift, I'm really glad you picked that because it's the one on that album. It's like the sleeper right in the middle that I think kind of, sums that album up.
Oh, that one, and then Monitor, where she turned it over and started on side 2. Those two are the fear engines of that record. I think.
And what a great kind of two sides of the same coin, because Monitor comes in, you've got that thundering guitar riff, and it's like, you know, so punk driving. Great record.
Yeah.
So my number 4. Now, we've had a conversation about this separately. That I think they might be on your list as well. Sisters of Mercy. And I picked 9 Wild 9 from First and Last and Always, 1984. Obviously, Sisters of Mercy, not goth at all. Andrew Eldritch, not goth at all. That's one for the Heartlanders. Andrew Eldritch may not be a goth. He isn't a goth, but Sisters of Mercy absolutely are. Those early singles are so crucial, aren't they? You know, we could talk about Reptile House, even, you know, the first one, Body Electric and Adrenochrome, which is a favourite track of mine. I've always loved that song. The Reptile House sounds like Bridlington, where it's produced. If anybody listening doesn't know Bridlington, it's very rainy. Seaside town about 20 miles from where I'm sat right now. There's a great passage in Mark Andrews' book, Paint My Name in Black and Gold, where they go into quite a lot of detail about how that EP was recorded. And, you know, there's almost an entire page dedicated to Andrew trying to get the drum machine EQ right, and just the do, do, hours of that, while the others just kind of sit. It goes a long way to explaining, I think, the reputation he gets these days. But so why did I pick 9 While 9? First and last on the ways is possibly if somebody said, give me one album that is, the best goth album ever, if such a thing exists, which obviously it doesn't. I can't not go to that. Even though it's not my favourite, it's the one that I would probably go, yeah, here, check this out. Everything about it is jet black, and I'm not just talking about the sleeve. The production has this murk to it. Dave Allen produced it. He'd worked with Chameleons. Yet the instruments sound so full of life. The way Gary Martz and Wayne Hussey had joined by then brought a completely different style to the band. And really, I think, developed the sound, brought these lovely acoustic touches and 12-string stuff, and really a musicality that they hadn't had up to that point. And then you've got Craig Adams just holding down the bass, absolutely rock steady all the way, never going out of time. And Gary's kind of more limited guitar ability, but he just had this instinct to write brilliant guitar parts, and the combination of all of that distilled into 10 songs. It sounds like a singular vision distilled into 10 songs, and the best song on that for me is 9 While 9. It's ironic given how torturous the making of that album was. Andrew, I think that almost adds to the mystique of it, that it very nearly didn't happen.
And weird things that you found out when you were doing it in retrospect that you couldn't have known it was spooky at the time, but the fact that that album was supposed to come out in October 1984, and it was called Black October, and when it was supposed to come out was when the IRA blew up the hotel.
Yeah.
That's kind of thing does make you go, ooh,
So I'd love to get your take on this, actually, Cathi, because you mentioned earlier they were your favourite band for a long time. So 9 While 9, it makes a real case for his genius status that people bestow on him.
Lyrics do, actually, because they do really hold up.
They do, and I think they're so evocative and romantic, yet never contrived. There's always that wry smile sitting behind it all, which I think goes easily misinterpreted, which is evident in the legions of bands that have copied this album terribly.
But you mentioned earlier, like a song like "Thick." I got quite fixated on the lyrics to that when I was writing, because I think he's writing. I'm sure he's writing about the world that we were living in then, and the fix for the corpse for the corporation, and how everything was being totally fixed in terms of what happened to the miners was being fixed, what happened with Rupert Murdoch was being fixed. Everything was a massive clandestine fix that we have not, some of the stories haven't come to light, only just come to light decades later, how much of a fix this was. And it does make you think at some point, did he have a crystal ball?
Yeah, you do wonder, don't you? Because there's that whole record just sounds so apocalyptic. And it felt, I've spoken to a couple of Sisters fans about this, from the time, that they said it felt like the end of something rather than the beginning, which is not the opposite of what a debut album should feel like. Did you feel like that about it?
Yeah, it did, actually. And at that time, it was when I stopped listening to quite a lot of music that was going, because it was the same time as that C86 thing and all the Wedding Present and all that. So I actually started listening in earnest to Led Zeppelin around that point, and Jimi Hendrix and the Doors, and like discovering myself that stuff, that new records that were coming out weren't stuff that you wanted to hear. There's loads you can find in the bargain bins of record shops that your band have mentioned in that were influences on them, and you can listen and you can like go, bloody hell, this is amazing. So
yeah, so that's my number 4, 9 While 9. So number 5.
Number 5 for me is Sex Talk by Soft Cell. I had to put this in there because it was such a hilarious. Now I think about this as well, the notoriety of that video that they made with Tim Pope was the director, and it immediately got banned. So my brother, who's a massive, massive Soft Cell Mark Almond fan, he managed to find this video, and I still don't actually know where he procured it from, but it was the centerpiece of this amazing album, Non-Stop Erotic Cabaret, which a few years ago, and probably about 10 years ago now, I was around a friend of mine, Charlie Fink, who was in a really great band called the Caesareans, and him and his wife's longboat that they lived on at the time. And he said, "When's the last time you listened to this?" And he said, "What do you think? No, what is it?" And he put it on, and from the first second of that laugh, I thought, "Oh my God, it's so," because I listened to that record so many times. And I hadn't listened to it for ages. And what I thought about it now, and this is, as somebody who's written a load of novels and got quite obsessed with the early 60s as a result of one of my novels, I got really into that time period. And that's how I came to know so much about Joe Meek as well, because he was a part of that. It was like, oh my God, it's like an Angry Young Man novel from the 60s turned into an album in the 80s. And the thing I thought about was Billy Liar, and how at the end of that film, he doesn't get on the train from Leeds to London, but Mark and Dave did get on the train. And at the end of the train was this Soho sleazy world that they made such fantastic use of in that record. And now you listen to the whole album. Well, to me, it sounds like a brilliant novel. So hats off to those two, but I just wanted to include that one because it was the sleaziest one, and that my brother rose to the quest of finding the band video.
So there's a little story about that in the book, and where did he get it from? Well, according to, so I asked, my dad and my uncle over the years, we've had sort of talks about, where they procured things from that they didn't want their parents to see. A lot of things turning up in bushes and.
Yes, yeah. Funny how they did in the countryside. The caches of dirty mags under bushes, yeah, on the field, yeah.
So, number 5 for me, rather fittingly, Sex Gang Children, Shout and Scream. 1983, again. That's a good year, 1983. Sex Gang, I think Andy never gets the respect he deserves, and I think this whole album is just awesome. It's from Song and Legend, their debut. Tony James produced this one from Seed, and Sisters of Mercy later on, and many, many other things. It's just got everything's just so wrong about this, and there's big influence there on those kind of 90s dark cabaret bands, Cinema Strange and all that kind of thing. It's scary stuff, but it's so addictive. Short songs, off-the-wall lyrics, there's these allusions to art and French cinema. London gone to ruin as well, Andy never ever shied away from wanting to make a political statement. He was a militant squatter.
Yeah, that was a huge part of the goth thing.
Yeah, and it hasn't really dated, and I think the production's so off the wall, but it gives everything lots of space. And I think Shout and Scream, the track I've picked in particular, really sums up the kind of seedy, grisly, cold, dank atmosphere of this whole thing. It feels dark, it feels a little dangerous, but it's also totally unpredictable, like all of their early material was. You've got that really cold, kind of skeletal opening, then all of a sudden, bang, you're in with a time change and everything's going, lots of bass, drums, tom-tom fills. Mixing wise, I spoke to Terry McCly about this when I met them at a gig here in York a few years ago when they actually played this album, and he kind of said that the kind of power of the album was diluted by the mix, and I can see that because it's quite a thin sounding album, but it's got so much life to it, and you put it on from the word go, it's just go 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 all the time. And yeah, I think again, Sex Gang Children, another career just muddied by bad luck, bad decisions. So number 6.
My number 6, when you're talking about how brilliant things sound, this is one of the sounds still to this day, one of the greatest records. It's Theatre of Hate, Do You Believe in the Westworld? produced
so,
by. Yeah.
so glad you put this in because I had to leave it out.
No, you can't leave this out. I mean, they were the most amazing live band, and Kirk Brandon, and he still is the most amazing. Uh, what's the word I'm searching for? He really pulled you, and he had the most. I think he had the most sort of distinctive voice since Johnny Rotten. Actually, almost that kind of way he sounds like he's getting possessed. The way that Johnny Rotten used to when he got really into, and he really goes into that on this, and I love that whole Ennio Morricone landscape that Mick James created with him there, and that sort of almost dubby feel that there is to this production. And I love the fact that Kirk spent loads of nights in the fantastic Electric Cinema on Portobello Road watching this stuff and then applying the fantastic soundtrack that he heard watching stuff like Once Upon a Time in the West and that into this record and that song in particular. And he is asking, and Cowboy Ronnie had just taken power in America. Let's not forget that. The scariest president, well, until Trump anyway, the scariest president, but just when you think it can't get any scarier. But anyway, for that time being, that was a pretty scary, and he's talking about that, but he's doing it in a really, really fantastic way of evoking that whole Old West and how I used a quote from Gil Scott-Heron actually in my book from B-Movie about how America thought it was in trouble, so it wanted the cavalry to come back in, and if they could have had John Wayne for president, they would have done, but since he was no longer available, they got B-Movie Cowboy Ronnie instead. And I think that Kirk sang all that in a really stylish, fantastic way. But
Definitely.
also, it's just that song just still takes your head off when you listen to it now.
It does, and from the minute those drums come in, and if ever I'm sort of at a goth night or anything like that, and it gets played, or if I go and see the band live, which I always try, they always make a point of stopping off here in York, so I will always go, because I love Spear as well, and I love all the records they've continued to put out. I think the last Theatre of Hate album, A Thing of Beauty, is exactly that. But that title track, Do You Believe in the Westworld? Oh my god, it's just so good. And the whole record is amazing. Judgment Hymn, Trail of Tears, and you're absolutely right. I think the way he uses his voice and the look that he had, the way that they kind of presented themselves on stage, everything about it just sucked you in. And you get the feeling with Kirk, there's something going on in the back of his head all the time.
Yeah, I think like Johnny Rotten, he does get quite possessed by what he's singing about and getting he was a big part of that squat scene you mentioned, and getting quite raged up, and it all comes out in his amazing, charismatic performances, really.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, again, a band that really kind of fell apart before they could have.
I know it's like snatching defeat from the jaws of victory, time after time with each of his bands, really, sadly.
Yeah, I mean, the nice thing now is that there seems to be a bit more of stability where it's kind of Kirk and a couple of players who've been with him for a long time. Adrian Porter's has been with him for a long time now. And then the divide really will tend to be, if Stanley's playing with them, they'll go out as Theatre of Hate. If not, they go out as Spear, and they honour both ends of the catalogue, which seems to be working really well for them, and they can still cut it,
Every band on both of our lists. The thing is that seeing them live is better than any of the albums anyway.
Yeah, absolutely.
Huge part of the deal was just, seeing them live was so brilliant.
And speaking of live versus album, my number 6, Virgin Prunes, Decline and Fall from If I Die, I Die. So this is 1982. Now, if ever there was a disparity between live and studio, I think it's this. Colin Newman from Wire produced this, and it's so... I listened to this again this morning, and what struck me about this is how well produced this album is in terms of it sounds so fresh. It doesn't suffer from a kind of an indie production that some of these other albums do, but it doesn't sound so high end that you start getting into like gated reverbs and all of those things that kind of dog it as the 80s, which I love. I'm a sucker for Phil Collins, all that, you know.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. Nothing dates the 80s as bad as those kind of sounds.
But I think, you know, this album's a really interesting one because you've got this railing against Catholicism in a Dublin that's far less progressive than the one we see today. They were a big inspiration on other Irish bands of the time because of their complete bristling against that. They were the perfect foil for U2. Obviously, they were all good friends, went to school together, gave each other nicknames, and kind of formed the Lipton Village, this kind of, you know, kind of mythical, made-up society for them all to kind of hang out in and just be themselves away from what was going on at the time. And I think if ever a visitation was captured in song, I think Decline and Fall is exactly that. It's beautiful, it's unsettling. There's that ominous drone running all the way through it. The guitars sound like mice running across harpsichord keys. And then you've got the vocals, you know, I think doing the split vocal thing is quite hard to do. You've got Googie and Gavin Friday singing on a lot of these tracks, David Basorius as well. But Gavin is the one who kind of, I think, kind of comes out as the talismanic kind of rock star voice, and he kind of takes the lead on this.
Yeah, he's born with the gift of the golden voice.
Yeah, and it's got like this Bowie and Victoriana thing going on, and there's this kind of, I don't know, it's kind of like this clash of innocence and childhood's end, and then what comes next. You know, there's this fascination with death as well. But it's interesting, this album, because they changed these songs so much before and after, including Decline and Fall, and it's like it captures one part of what they were. And if they'd recorded it 10 days later, it would have probably sounded completely different.
That's a really good point.
Yeah, and you know, live they were it was art house, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was confrontation, like Lydia with when she did Teenage Jesus. It was like, yeah, it was challenging for the audience, but also I think holding a mirror up and saying, you know, how close can this go to your face? You know? Like you allude to, they just had it a lot harder because Ireland then would be like England had been 30 years before.
Yeah, and I think I picked Decline and Fall really because I think it sums up that kind of yearning for innocence that kind of runs through a lot of their work, even when they were being confrontational.
Yeah, no, it's a good point, that innocent love.
But but then I kind of look to the back half of the record, and you've got a song as good and as catchy as Wolves of Jericho, and you think, oh my god, that's like genius. You know, so they could write club hits as well. They were completely capable of doing that, and I think it was like, you know, but they were clearly kind of coming from a place that wasn't anywhere near that.
No, and I think what's so brilliant is that every little weirdo in every little village in Ireland must have seen them and gone, phew, I'm not alone.
Cool. Number 7 then.
Although my one is Sisters of Mercy Heartland, and we've talked loads about the sisters before, but I won't say too much, but I just want to pick up on the Eldritch and this crystal ball thing again, because listening to this in retrospect, this came out the year before the miners' strike, but again, he seems to see that in his crystal ball coming up and the blue lights across the road. And you know, I wished I could have quoted all the lyrics in my book, but I wasn't allowed to. Only 2 lines got put in there, but if you'd listened to them all. And, you know, that was when the dancing reached its height, my heartland and all. But it's almost like, and it's interesting, isn't it, as well? We also said Bradford and Leeds at the centre of the Goth's own county, actually. But the 2 most charismatic singers aren't from either of those places. Eldritch is from Ely.
He is.
Almost claim him from an East Anglia. And obviously Justin's from from Buckinghamshire, from a little strange Quaker village of Jordans that he comes from, but both of them fetch up in these cities at the time when they and form their bands at the time in the middle of the early to mid '80s when it's all going to start kicking off, and are really the most articulate voices of that time, to me anyway,
No,
in
absolutely.
very different ways, but yeah.
No, absolutely. I think, like we were saying about talking about Kirk Brandon and the Theatre of Hate, again with Eldritch and with Justin as well, you always got the feeling there was way more going on than what you were presented with.
Yeah, indeed.
So my number 7, Coil, Ubu Noir from 1984. Now, you mentioned England's Hidden Reverse earlier on, which is a fantastic book. I've got it in there, actually. If anybody's kind of interested in this side of the culture, I think that's a really good kind of primer, because there's also a really great like kind of suggested listening bit in there. But this is from their debut album, Scatology. And right from the beginning of the career, John Balance and Peter Christopherson, the two kind of mainstays, they were a filthy pair. This was music that challenged you. It forced you to examine yourself and your desires. There's this sense of like faded glamour, like the alleyway behind the theatre, and kind of looking behind the velvet curtain, stuff you really shouldn't be seeing. And I think, it forces you to challenge what you know about yourself, I think, music like this. But it feels very free. At the same time, there's brass all over it. Jim Thirlwell's in there under the pseudonym Clint Ruin. There's a bit of that kind of industrial grime. But there's this sense of faded glamour and almost kind of a theatricality insofar as, and not in like a Sex and Children theatricality, in a Broadway theatricality. Some of these songs feel like they should be coming at you in sepia.
Yeah. I started thinking about Jack the Ripper's London when you were saying that, and Dan Leno and the Limehouse Golem and all that sort of stuff. That world, that's the world that brings to mind to me.
Yeah, and I mean there's an interesting thing here with Mark Arman that you mentioned earlier, because I was looking when I started listening to Coil again to do this. And because you mentioned the Some Bizarre label in your book, and how diverse that label was in terms of what it put out.
And how Steve-O was like this brilliant little enfant terrible that everyone was so scared of, because it was like he was one of the Dreegs from Clockwork Orange.
Yeah.
And he'd come for the music business. He was so young. So, yeah, and that sampler, that was the really weird thing, that first sampler he had, it a Soft Cell on and Blancmange and all these bands that went on to be really huge, and the one that got signed off a major label was the one that you've never heard of. And so memorable are they that I've forgotten who they were now. Sorry, no, it's just my brain malfunctioning. But it's in the book.
So that was my number 7. So number 8.
So mine is, you're probably loads of people are going, why haven't this been in here yet? But The Birthday Party, probably, alongside the Cramps, the other most formidable and terrifying and amazing band from this period. He came over from the lovely sun-drenched shores of Melbourne into a disgusting digs in Earl's Court, in the time-honoured passage of their countrymen, and basically shook up the world. I mean, Deep in the Woods is on their last EP, The Bad Seed, and this, to me, this is Nick Cave sort of after this he will ditch, he'll go in a different, but this is the first time, and he's really properly engaging with that gun club sort of deep south. And they've moved to Berlin. They did make it in London, but they're disillusioned with it now, and they've moved to Berlin, and where they can, where he really, I think, Nick really reinvents himself. and recording in the same place that David Bowie did Low and all that whole brilliant world of Kreuzberg that existed in those days. And really interesting to me. I'd forgotten and I reread Ian Johnson's brilliant book Bad Seed and how he wrote this song Travelling Through the Black Forest, which is the heart of the German romantic imagination.
Yes.
But this is a song of him starting off writing his And I Saw the Angel on this full Jim Thompson trip deep in the woods. And it's also the last stand of the godlike genius of Roland S. Howard, who I would argue alongside John McGeoch, the two greatest guitarists of the 80s, who all other guitarists were kind of in their image. They were so, and interesting to me that they both studied art and they brought so much art into their playing. And yeah, I think Roland really rose. His playing on this is amazing. Like, we're not in, we've spun into it. It's like the Wizard of Oz effect. He's spun you up into that tornado and everything's gone from black and white into color, and we're not in Kreuzberg anymore. We're
It's really interesting because there's a fantastic biography about Joni Mitchell where she talks about applying painting, because she was a painter right up until she started making music, and a very good one too, still is. She talks about applying painting principles to music, and I definitely think McGeoch and Roland S. Howard have that.
Yeah, they do.
Because they clearly don't think in terms of riffs or guitar parts, you can't write something like just off the top of my head, you can't write something like Arabian Nights from a guitarist's point of view traditionally. There's just no way.
Yeah, and he was more influenced by the pop artist Robert Rauschberg than he was in any other guitarist. And Roland also went to art school, and it's really impressionistic, and he really channeled it into that world. And I did also want to say how Nick Cave is a brilliant, charismatic frontman, but he's always backed by people who are equally brilliant. And Tracy Pugh and Mick Harvey also equally brilliant. And Mick Harvey,
absolutely,
so multi-talented for somebody who says, I can't really play. And he's been on some of the, the Crime in the City Solution and These Immortal Souls stuff, and his own amazing solo record with Serge. He is a genius as well. And they all, those four that are on, the remaining four that did this album, all.
And they lived with one of my favourite bands from Australia, the Go-Betweens. They all shared, flats and all of that kind of thing when they were in London. And Mick, because Nick Cave is so known, I do think Mick gets, to people not so familiar with the band, I think Mick gets left out of the conversation. But yeah, he, again, I think a really overlooked talent.
Oh, I don't think Nick would have got where he is without having Mick having his back, actually, because he was the only one of them who was organised for a start.
Yeah.
But he's also, I love the fact that he came back. He'd done stuff with Crime and City Solution, and as soon as obviously he came back for Roland and helped them get their stuff out on mute and playing in those bands and just not, remembering his friends. So, yeah.
Cool. So my number 8, Gone Like the Swallows from 1986 by And Also the Trees. Now, And Also the Trees are an interesting one. I had the pleasure of interviewing Simon Hugh Jones for this podcast back in September, I think it was. They're a favourite band of mine, so I think it deserves a spot on here. And I think they're gothic in the traditional sense that they have that poetic kind of countryside centric. There's a certain, what I love about them is that they capture the beauty of the countryside and also the kind of, there's always darkness lurking in.
Countryside, there always is.
There certainly is. And I think, for me, the reason why they're so special to me is that I grew up in a rural environment, and none of the bands that I was listening to that had this sound quite captured that. in the
Right.
same way that they have. And I think that was really unusual. And I still don't think the marrying of post-punk is traditionally seen, I think, as quite an urban period. You know, they were listening to Joy Division and bands like that when they started. But they kind of, because they were so isolated,
Mm,
started to take influence from their environment. And
yeah.
I think it's interesting that they chose to stay there rather than move to the city.
Yeah.
And I don't think they would have developed in the way they did if it wasn't for that.
Mm,
Justin Jones, their guitar player, again, talking about great guitar players, somebody who never ever gets talked about, I don't think,
mm,
for how, again, pushing the instrument and pushing sounds and the way he kind of developed. Simon actually told me this in the podcast, and Justin had just mentioned it to him over dinner. They're brothers, by the way, for anybody who doesn't know that. He mentioned it over dinner quite recently that, oh yeah, I got the idea for doing the kind of the mandolin style guitar from a street musician in Italy when we first went over there. I just saw this guy and playing a balalaika, I think it was, and and then bang, they had their sound. And Simon kind of said that to me as soon as Justin got that, they went, that's
yeah.
that's who we are. And married with Simon had this great way with imagery, still does. And Gone Like the Swallows is a great example. It's off their album Virus Meadow, which was their second album, which is the one that I think most people are probably familiar with. And yeah, I just think they capture the romanticism and the kind of wind in the fences
Yeah.
dichotomy of being in the countryside, and that there's this fantastic ideal of the rolling hills and the flowery meadows, but then you're also very, very isolated from everything, and it's very easy for that to overwhelm you. And I think they capture that perfectly.
Like kind of the way The Cure did in their early records, and I noticed we haven't got a Cure track here. So I would say the link is with Nick Drake actually, with
Yes,
those dark autumnal landscapes of his songs.
absolutely. And it's an interesting one because And Also the Trees were discovered by Lol Tolhurst, who produced their first album.
Yeah.
And yeah, I think The Cure, like you said, there is this. I'd never thought about it before. Yeah, that particularly maybe on 17 Seconds in particular, there is a sort of Nick Drake-ishness to that.
Yeah, and when I was lucky enough to meet Lol and talk to him about it, and he said he was a massive. They did really. I mean, but he wouldn't. I mean, what has anyone ever wrote a more enigmatic? And again, like the whole Ian Curtis thing, the fact that he left so young as well, and it's
And I think the fact that his records weren't really weren't really venerated until years after he died.
if it weren't for Joe Boyd, they wouldn't even exist. So,
No.
mm,
Another fantastic kind of, auteur, if you like, of music, Joe Boyd. He's put a really good book out as well, White Bicycles, which is worth reading.
you should get. He's doing a new book at the moment. You should get him on your show.
Is he?
He knows everything and everyone. He's an
That's
amazing
interesting.
person. Yeah, he is.
Yeah, fascinating guy. Number 9.
Oh, is it me again? Well,
is.
I've already mentioned him. It's New Model Army and it's Christian Militia, and I chose this one. It could have been any on Vengeance, which the thing is about that record is it's still 40 years on. It's every track is still as relevant as when they were freshly minted. But maybe this is because this is the scariest one because Trump is the scary entity that Justin summons and sings about. He was obviously singing about Ronald Reagan and his fan base at the time, but Trump's fan base, if anything, is even more disturbingly worshipping the devil in the name of God than they were.
Yeah, it's frightening, isn't it? I mean, you said it at the beginning of this, and my parents have said it. My partner's parents have said it. It feels like it did before.
Yeah.
Um,
And what's really spooky about Trump as well is like how the first line in this song, there's a witch hunt coming. every time somebody criticizes Trump, he says, "It's a witch hunt." He's using turning the black magic back.
I know.
Yeah.
No, I mean, it's you could say this about a lot of New Model Army's songs, actually, that a bit like with Eldritch and with Kirk Brandon as well, you know. They must have had some seer visit them at some point, you
The
know.
black mirror,
Yeah.
crying mirror.
So number 9 for me is Angel by the Dance Society. So this is from their Heaven is Waiting album, 1983, again. This really sticks out. They're a special band for me, because I think they kind of stuck out even at the time in the way that they kind of put their stuff together, because they had this sort of almost Hawkwind element to them, and yet they were kind of grabbing at krautrock, but they had that kind of tough Yorkshire spine to them all the way through. Seen a lot of reviews bemoaning the drum sound on Heaven is Waiting, saying how processed it sounds. Having played in a band with Paul Gilmartin, that's just how hard he hits the drums. You know, my hearing was almost permanently destroyed being in a practice room with the man. So thanks, Paul, if you're listening. But yeah, produced by Nigel Gray, who did Juju by the Banshees. Really kind of doomy, foggy sound to this one. But really well crafted songs. I know a lot of the early fans of Seduction and the kind of early singles weren't big on this because it was a little bit more produced. And even if you read the liner notes to the remasters, Lyndon Scarf, the keyboard player, had kind of mixed feelings and still has mixed feelings about signing to Arista, which is it is a weird label to sign a goth band to. But you know, I think they pulled it off with this album. And Angel's an interesting one because it's built entirely around the sequencer, and I think really epitomizes their sort of a bit like Bauhaus kind of sound collage approach, because there's no real structure to it. The chorus has by far the most lyrics in the song, and it's kind of been picked up more recently again with there's a really good and healthy kind of dark wave and post-punk revival scene in the States, particularly on the West Coast, and it's been picked up by a lot of those bands and gets put in DJ sets on streaming platforms. A friend of mine, Rachel Redfern, who isn't American, but she puts it in her DJ sets a lot, and yeah, it's one of those kind of, I think the Dance Society are one of those that they never really again got going when they could have. I know Ray Manzarek was actually teed up to produce this, saw the band at the Dominion Theatre in London, left halfway through, and that was that. But yeah, I think a band that kind of deserved more than they got. Yeah, that's my number 9.
To put those in, yeah, it's true.
Number 10, last picks.
Well, mine is The Killing Moon by Echo and the Bunnymen, the most magical and beautiful. And I mean, it could probably have been any song on that fantastic album, Ocean Rain, which is a masterpiece. I think on par with anything the Doors did. It's just as good. And it's not unreasonable of Ian McCulloch to say it's the greatest record ever made. And I just love the story of how he dreamt those lyrics. And, you know, it's like when Roy Orbison wrote In Dreams, which is another amazingly unearthly record that doesn't age and speaks to listen to you now. Just had to sit up. And I also love the other part of the magic for me with him doing the David Bowie chords to Starman backwards. That's such a brilliant magic spell that he did.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And I think his vocals I mean, you could say this a bit. I know he's not fond of his vocals on those albums, but to me, he was one of the finest singers this country has ever produced at that time.
Yeah. And, you know, the whole band are at their peak of brilliance on this. Will Sargent's always brilliant. I love Heaven Up Here as much. And when, you know, even mentioning that song, A Promise earlier, what a brilliant song that is. I do think things had become so grim by the time this album came out. And one of my My most successful fiction that I ever done was this book Weirdo, which is like fiction version of of Season of the Witch, but set in 1984. And the two albums I listened to the most when writing that was Vengeance and The Killing Moon. And The Killing Moon, I mean Ocean Rain, as every chapter has got a song taken from that album because I opened up the whole time tunnel of that year to me in a way that none of the other records did. It was like I was seeing everything again.
It's really interesting because Ocean Rain, again, a bit like with First and Last and Always, there is a sense of finality with that because
Yeah,
obviously they would release the Grey album 3 years
nothing
later.
ever would be that good again.
And
That's it.
yeah, and it is a sense of where would you go from there?
Yeah,
But you're right, every track is perfect, and Fran and I went to see them do Ocean Rain in Liverpool with the orchestra this last tour. We went for her birthday actually in September last year. And even now, every song, it exists in this magical space. And my favourite Bunnyman album, I think, is Heaven Up Here.
yeah.
Possibly Crocodiles, because Crocodiles was the first one I got, so that always holds a special place in my heart. But yeah, I think Ocean Rain and obviously The Killing Moon in particular, nobody else has really quite sounded like that.
No, they haven't actually.
And I like the fact that you mentioned the whole band because I think Les Pattinson and Pete DeFreitas, I think, one of the finest rhythm sections from this time.
Well, I thought, he said, Will Sargent said he'd found one of those teardrop guitars that Brian Jones had, and it made me think that Brian Jones he was so brilliant that he could pick up instruments and play them really quickly. And so all the different sounds and textures you hear on early Rolling Stone stuff come from him. And they actually, without him, they never do get any nothing like that comes in again. And I had the feeling that on this album that the Bunnymen were being similarly experimental, and they were in Paris where that flea market is, and they found all this treasure in the flea market and they were bringing it back into the studio. And I like the fact that Les and Will were sort of adventurers and they'd gone off together on all these journeys and discovered things, and that, that Les was a salty sea dog and with all
That's my favourite thing about Will's books, because this is in both of them all the way through, is that on the one hand you had Les, who was very practical, could fix things, could fix anything, and then on the other hand you had Mac, who never had a dirty hand, and yet, you have this, like you said, they got
bags outside to do any. Yeah, it's brilliant. Yeah.
And I think, the idea of going and finding all these great instruments, and because they were always experimental, weren't they? The first 4 albums are all very, very, there's lots of strange textures in there. But the first 3, it was almost like they had to make do with what they had. And then Ocean Rain, let's go and get all of these weird and wonderful things. And my favourite story about The Killing Moon is that the guitar riff, or the guitar part at the start, which is the bit that everybody kind of immediately identifies with it, wasn't even in the track. It was Will just tuning up his 12-string. I think it was the first thing, he just played it. And David Lord, the producer, they went out for dinner or something, or went out in Paris for the evening. David Lord, the producer, took that, having heard it, whacked it at the start, and there you go, there's the song.
So yeah, the Beatles had George Martin. Yeah.
And isn't that just the perfect marriage of like clear talent and just magic, happenstance.
Fate.
Yeah, up against you, Will.
Exactly.
So my number 10, final one, is Mesmerism by Dead Can Dance from 1985. So Spleen and Ideal, this is their second record, and it's the one where they kind of became who they kind of still are, really. They were kind of caught between the two worlds. I mean, even the first album, it had traditional Western structures to it, but they were still kind of experimented with a lot of things on there, a lot of different sounds. But Spleen and Ideal, I think, was where they started to abandon traditional structures and start to reach out and look for, look around the world, literally. And there's classical influences in there, and I think this is a bit like talking about First and Last and Always being a singular vision. I think Spleen and Ideal onwards, all of Dead Can Dance's albums are like that, and they're gothic in that big cathedrals of sound sense. You have Lisa Gerrard's incredible voice, and Brendan Perry was always very deft with arrangements. For all the stuff that goes on their albums and all of their pieces of music, lots of synthetic and organic strings and, weird and wonderful instruments. He's really good at coming up with really there are always hooks in his arrangements, and everything kind of has its place. Nothing ever feels cluttered in any way. And what I love about that is that he knows the singer in his band is brilliant, and he lets Lisa do her thing. And I think this is, Mesmerism is one song off of this album, but I could have picked anything. But I just think Dead Can Dance have that transport. They're able to transport you. They have that ability to kind of take you away from anything you're doing, wherever you are. And I think, it was. I felt they deserved a spot on my list. They're not a band I listen to often, but when I do, it's all I can focus on because it's so vast.
Yeah, you criticise very passionately and convincingly for them, I would say.
But my number 10. We did it. We did all 20. I'm going to pop this into a list, and I'll sort of share that round when we do the episode. But I wanted to say really thank you for your time, Cathi, because I know we've
it's been brilliant, actually.
It's been great fun.
You ever read this one of my books?
No, I haven't. I was looking when I was kind of looking at your bibliography a couple of days ago. That came up, so I'm gonna order myself a copy of that.
It's really irritating me out of print at the moment, but it's just I think it's a bit weird because it's the lead main character in there and you share certain things in common. Like you, he wants to go back. And he starts off in Camden Town as well. When you just said that's when you started doing this was from. So if I had a bloody spare one, I'd send it to you. But I haven't got any left because it's such a hard, grim life being a writer.
I'll keep an eye out though, because that was the one that sort of really, when I was kind of reading about the novels you've written, that was the one that I thought, I really want to check that out. So I must see if I can get myself a copy of it.
I'm really, really hoping that the Goth book would get me a publisher who would do that one and Weirdo again, because they are the most Goth novels that I wrote. So,
fingers crossed, hopefully, with the paperback coming out.
Yeah.
So before we wrap up, what have you got going on at the moment? Anything you want to share before we say goodbye?
I have got some events coming up, but do you know what? I'm a bit brain dead.
Where can people go to find out?
Do you know what? I've got my website, cathyunsworth.co.uk. I'm doing the Lawn Festival. I think that's the next one, which is in Dylan Thomas's birthplace in Wales, which is a lovely one and run by John Williams, who you've got all
fantastic
at his festival. And then I'm doing the Bournemouth Festival. Writing Festival in April, and also I'm supposed to be doing one up in Haworth where the Brontes come from up in April as well.
Very nice. Have you been up to Haworth before?
Yes, I have many times.
Yeah, it's lovely over there.
You can see how she just walked out of that churchyard and wrote that book.
Absolutely. Right. Yeah, absolutely.
The same with when you go to Whitby Abbey and you just think, he just sat there and wrote Dracula, didn't he, while the boat came into the harbour.
Thank you so much. It's been really great chatting to you, and thank you so much for agreeing to do this in the first place. Because, like I say, this is really just a passion project, and it's kind of got quite a small audience. So, thank you for. How awesome was that? Great to have Cathi on the podcast. Eternally grateful to her for agreeing to come on to this. It's a passion project. There aren't many of you out there listening, so I Cathi, if you're listening to this right now, I really, really appreciate your time and your candor. It was a lot of fun. I think we can all agree. Don't forget to check the Spotify playlist out in the description of this video/recording if you want to check out our picks and listen to those. Don't forget to like, subscribe, leave a comment, all that stuff. And from everybody here at New Musical Chairs, which is me, see you next time. Take care.